Imagine a lens with a constant f2 aperture and a massive zoom range of 14 millimeter to 500 millimeter. It would be a truly colossal piece of engineering, and since the f-stop is the ratio of the focal length to the diameter of the aperture, a 500 millimeter f2 lens would require an opening in front end element of at least 250 millimeters, or about 10 inches, and that's in diameter. Now, combine that with the complex mechanisms needed for a 14 millimeter wide angle, the lens would likely weigh hundreds of pounds and require its own dedicated support system. Well, this is the holy grail of camera lenses. A single piece of glass that goes from an ultra-wide 14 millimeter to a super-wide 500 millimeters, all while keeping it ridiculously bright with that constant f2 aperture. It's a lens that would change photography forever. It would capture sprawling landscapes and distant birds with the same impossible brilliance. It's the one lens to rule them all. And it's completely impossible. Hi, I'm Steve, and let's dig into the challenges that would be faced to make this lens and stick around to the end to find out why it's impossible to build. Well, you're asking yourself, why is this lens impossible to build? It's just made out of metal and glass, right? Well, to figure that out, we have to dig into the fundamentals of the physics of light, as well as the wild challenges of optical engineering and the surprising trade-offs that are baked into every single lens you've ever used. The answer reveals not only just what we can't or why we can't build this lens, but why every lens is its own minor miracle compromise. So what are we even asking for here? Well, let's break down this dream lens. First, that focal range of 14 millimeter to 500 millimeter. At 14 millimeter, you get the epic ultra-wide field of view. Think dramatic architecture, sweeping vistas, or getting right up in the subject's face while still showing their entire world. It's a perspective that just feels vast. Then, with a simple twist of a ring, you'd zoom right past the standard 24, 35, and 50 millimeter focal lengths, blow past the classic 85 millimeter portrait lens, and just keep going. You'd fly by 200 millimeters, which is the standard for many telephoto zooms, and push into serious wildlife and sports territory at 300, 400, and finally at 500 millimeters. At 500 millimeters, you're pulling faraway subjects incredibly close, creating the compressed, intimate look of distant mountains or a bird in flight. This is a zoom ratio of nearly 36 times the range that no single high-quality lens has ever dreamed of. Now for the really crazy part, a constant f2.0 aperture. The aperture is just an opening in the lens that lets the light pour in, and a smaller f number means a bigger opening. f2.0 is exceptionally large, what photographers call a fast lens. It would let your camera sensor just gulp down the light. This means incredibly low light performance, letting you shoot at night with far less noise. It also creates a stunning shallow depth of field, meaning that your subject will pop against a beautifully blurred background, whether it's a wide-angle portrait at 14 millimeter or a tight shot of an athlete at 500 millimeter. This one lens would replace the entire backpack of heavy prime and zoom lenses. It would be the ultimate tool for photojournalists, travelers, and documentarians. One lens, zero compromises. That's a dream. But to see why it stays a dream, we have to face the biggest hurdle of this, and that's the simple physics of light. Every single choice in lens design is a battle against physics, and the war for the fast aperture is fought on the front lines. To get why a f2.0 is so demanding, we need to talk about something called the entrance pupil. Think of a lens as a light bucket. The wider the opening of the bucket, the more rain it catches in a short period of time. The entrance pupil is the opening, and the f number is just the ratio. It's the lens focal length divided by the diameter of the entrance pupil. Let's do some quick math. For a 50 millimeter lens to have an f2.0 aperture, you need to have an entrance point of 50 divided by 2, which is 25 millimeters. And it's about an inch across, and that's totally manageable. Now, let's apply that to our monster. At 500 millimeter end, at an f2.0 aperture, we need an entrance pupil diameter of 500 divided by 2, and that's 250 millimeters, 10 inches. Let that sink in. The front piece of the glass of our lens would have to be at least 10 inches in diameter. They are 25 centimeters across. For compromise, the front of a Pro 7200 f2.8 lens is about 3 inches. We're talking about a piece of glass that is just absolutely monstrous. And it gets worse. That's just the entrance pupil, which isn't always the same as the physical front element, but dictates the scale of the entire optical system. Every chunk of glass behind that has to be scaled up to handle the massive cone of light coming from that huge opening. This brings us to one of the most extreme lenses ever built, and that's the Sigma 200 to 500 f2.8 lens. And yes, this beast is real. It's got a nickname known as the Green Monster. It weighs almost 16 kilograms, which is around 35 pounds, and needs its own battery pack, that is, just to power the zoom and autofocus. And that lens starts at 200 millimeter. Our Dream lens needs to do all that, but also zoom out to an impossibly wide 14 millimeter, which opens up a whole new can of worms. So we have a massive aperture problem. But the real kicker isn't just the aperture, it's its zoom range. Making a 14 millimeter lens is hard. Making a 500 millimeter lens is also hard. Making one lens that is great at both ends and everywhere else in between, that's where things really start to fall apart. Wide angle and telephoto lenses are basically two different species. They are trying to solve two different problems here. At the 14 millimeter end, the main challenge is to bend light from a huge angle of view into a flat sensor without turning the image into a distorted funhouse mirror mess. This needs a large, complex, and deeply curved front elements, that is, to fix things like barrel distortion, and that's where straight lines tend to bow outwards, and to keep the edges of the picture sharp. At the 500 millimeter telephoto end, the game completely changes. Now the lens is acting like a telescope. The main enemy here is chromatic aberration, and that's the ugly color fringing, usually purple or green, that appears on high contrast edges when different colors of light really don't actually bend at the exact same point. To fix this, designers use special expensive elements made of low dispersion glass. A zoom lens is a chaotic ballet of moving glass. As you twist the zoom ring, groups of lenses elements shift back and forth, changing the focal length while trying to keep the image sharp and corrected for all those different little problems. Most pro zooms stick to a modest 3 times or 4 times ratio, like the 24 to 70 or the 100 to 400. It's a well-known challenge among optical designers that once you push the zoom ratio past about 5 times, you start making serious trade-offs in image quality. Now our lens is asking for a whopping 36 times ratio. Trying to create one optical formula that perfectly corrects for wide angle distortion of 14 millimeters, and then, with a twist, flawlessly handles telephoto color fringing at 500 millimeters, all the while maintaining a 10-inch opening for the light, is a war that's on too many fronts. You need a ridiculously complex system with dozens of moving parts, each a potential point of failure, softness, or error. By the way, if you're finding this trip through the physics of photography interesting and you want more deep dives into how your gear actually works, think about subscribing. We're always exploring the science behind the art, and hitting that subscribe button is the best way to join in on the next one. Now let's get back to it. Even if a supercomputer could magically design the perfect optical formula for this lens, we still would slam headfirst into the brick wall, and that's reality. We just couldn't make it. First, the glass itself. That 10-inch front element and the many huge elements behind it would be absurdly heavy. Now the Canon's 28 to 70 f2, it's a real lens and I've got one. It has a 3 times zoom and it weighs in at 3 pounds or 1.4 kilograms. Scaling that up to our 14 to 500 millimeter design, we're talking about a lens you couldn't carry. We're talking about a lens that would probably weigh over 22 pounds, 10 kilograms, and be nearly 3 feet long. It would be less a camera lens and more like a piece of artillery. For context, the legendary Nikon 1200 to 1700 zoom f5.6 to 8, it's a beast used by sports photographers back in the 90s. Weighed in at 16 kilograms and was almost a meter long. And that aperture is way smaller than our f2.0. Then there's the precision. The special glass needed to control distortion would have to be ground with sub-micron accuracy. A single speck of dust, a tiny flaw inside that glass, would ruin the image quality, and the internal motors would need to be powerful enough to move these heavy glass groups with perfect speed and precision. And this is something far beyond our current autofocus technology that works, and they work just really hard with much lighter elements. Now on top of that, the alignment tolerances would be impossibly tight. In a lens with over a dozen moving optical groups, a misalignment of just a few microns in one group could cause the entire image to fall soft, and dust and moisture, which is already a headache for modern zooms, would become a critical point of failure in a design for this complex and open. You end up with a lens that would cost millions of dollars for a single unit, weigh more than a small child, and probably break if you looked at it the wrong way. It's just not happening with today's technology. So, we found our answer. The 14 to 500 millimeter f2 lens isn't impossible for one single reason. It's a perfect storm where the laws of physics, the limits of optical design, and the realities of manufacturing all collide in one spectacular failure. The huge f2.0 aperture at 500 millimeter demands an impossibly large and heavy system, while the wild 36 power zoom range forces a fight between opposing optical corrections that can't be won without terrible compromises. And the manufacturing itself is simply beyond what we can do in today's technology. The real-world lenses we use are already pushing the boundaries. A lens like the Canon RF 28 to 70 f2 gives us all of that incredible aperture by making a key compromise, a very limited zoom range. On the flip side, super zoom lenses that cover huge ranges do so by compromising on aperture, often chopping them down to 6.3 or f8 on the long end. And that's the real lesson on our possible lens. It reminds us that every lens is a story of compromise. It's a delicate dance between size, weight, cost, and aperture. There's no such thing as one perfect lens that does it all. There are just different sets of compromises for different jobs. The genius of the lens design isn't about achieving the impossible. It's about making the right trade-offs to create a tool that is not only excellent, but actually usable. So, as we look back at our beautiful non-existing Holy Grail, we can appreciate it for what it is. A thought experiment that highlights the incredible engineering and artistry that goes into the real lenses that we get to use every single day. Now, I have a question for you. If you could have your own impossible lens, what would the specs be? Let me know down below in the comments. This is Steve. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.